Welcome to The Explainer. Today we're going on a pretty incredible journey. A 500-year intellectual quest, actually. We're tracing the history of a really unique school of economic thought, the Austrian school.
So, how on earth did 15th century Spanish monks end up influencing modern economics? It sounds kind of wild, right? But believe it or not, that's exactly where our story kicks off. Centuries before the school of thought even had a name, its core ideas were taking shape, not in Vienna, but way down in Spain. Okay, so to get a handle on this whole story, we're going to break it down into 5 key parts. We'll start with those ancient roots, then meet the guy who started it all, Karl Menger. After that, we'll dive into Vienna's golden age, see what happened when they were forced into exile, and finally, look at how it all came roaring back in America. First up, those ancient roots. Let's trace the intellectual DNA, long before anyone was talking about an Austrian school. So get this. The people who some call the first economists, they were followers of St. Thomas Aquinas, teaching at the University of Salamanca in Spain. And the famous economist Joseph Schumpeter actually said, yeah, these guys were the first real economists. Why? Because they were already figuring out the laws of supply and demand, what causes inflation, and this really key idea that economic value isn't some fixed thing. It's subjective. It's all about what you think something is worth. Plus, they were big on property rights and free trade. Pretty amazing for the 15th century. And you can see how this wasn't just a one-off thing. There's a clear line here. The ideas from the scholastics didn't just disappear. They were picked up hundreds of years later by people like Richard Cantillon, who wrote what's considered the first real book on economics, and then fine-tuned by some really sharp thinkers in France.
And one of those thinkers, A.R.J. Turgot, who was actually the French finance minister, he said something that is just pure Austrian school 200 years before Hayek made it famous. He basically said, look, the real economic knowledge isn't in some government office. It's scattered among millions of individuals. Only the person on the ground has that local, specific knowledge you need.
Now, following in Turgot's footsteps was this guy, Frédéric Bastiat, and he gave us this amazing mental tool for thinking about economics. He said the real difference between a good economist and a bad one is simple. A good economist sees what's not there, the hidden, long-term effects of any action. And his best example of this is the famous broken window fallacy. It's brilliant. So imagine a kid breaks a shop window. The thing you see is the glazier getting, say, $50 to fix it. And you might think, hey, that's good for the economy. Money is moving around. But what Bastiat forces you to ask is, what is not seen? Well, the shopkeeper was going to spend that $50 on new shoes. So the shoemaker just lost a sale. No new wealth was created. It was just diverted from one person to another because of destruction. Okay, so all of this groundwork, all these ideas bubbling up over centuries, they all lead us to one specific place and time, Vienna, 1871. This is where the school officially gets its start. So, in 1871, this guy Karl Menger drops his book, Principles of Economics, and it's a bombshell. He introduces this revolutionary idea called marginal utility. It completely flipped the script on value. The idea isn't about how much labor went into something, but how much satisfaction you get from one more unit of it. You know, that first slice of pizza when you're starving, it's incredible. The 8th slice? Not so much. That's marginal utility in action. But Menger did way more and just explain prices. What he really did was rebuild economics from the ground up, starting with individual choice. He pushed back hard against the German school, which was all about just collecting historical data. Menger said, no, we can actually deduce universal economic laws just by thinking logically about what it means to be a human who acts with a purpose. He really became the founding father, the patriarch of this new Austrian school. And Menger's work just lit a fuse in Vienna. His students took his ideas and just ran with them. This kicked off a true golden age for the school. Yeah, you can really picture it like an intellectual relay race. Menger hands off the baton to his 2 star pupils, Eugen von Bembawerk and Friedrich von Wieser, and they immediately get to work, building on what he started.
So Bembawerk decides to tackle this big question, why do interest rates even exist? And his answer is this really elegant concept called time preference. It's just a universal human truth, right? We'd all rather have a good thing now than the exact same thing a year from now. All other things being equal, sooner is better than later. And he said, that's all interest is. It's the market price we put on time.
But there was still one piece of the puzzle that didn't quite fit: money. How does subjective value apply to money?
Well, sitting in Baumbawerk's seminar was this incredibly sharp young economist named Ludwig von Mises, and he decided to make that his mission.
And wow, did he deliver? His book in 1912, The Theory of Money and Credit, was a total game changer. Mises figured out how marginal utility applies to holding cash. But the really big thing he did was outline the Austrian theory of the business cycle. He argued that these big booms and busts aren't just a natural part of capitalism. Nope, he blamed them on central banks expanding credit artificially, which messes up interest rates and tricks businesses into making bad investments that eventually have to come crashing down.
But this incredible, vibrant, intellectual world of Vienna, it was living on borrowed time. The rise of Nazism, the chaos of war, it was all about to come crashing down, forcing the school's best minds to flee for their lives. And it was during this turbulent time that Mises and his top student, F.A. Hayek, got into this huge debate, the socialist calculation debate. The socialists were arguing that a central planning board could run an economy more efficiently. And Mises and Hayek's counterargument was just devastating. They said, it's not about being inefficient, it's that it's literally impossible. Without private property, you don't have real market prices. And without prices, a planner has no idea what's scarce and what's abundant. They are completely flying blind.
Mises himself made this harrowing escape from Europe and eventually landed in the United States. And that's where he sat down and wrote his magnum opus, Human Action. We're talking a nearly 900-page monster of a book that lays out the entire science of economics from a single starting point, the fact that humans act purposefully. He called this science praxeology. Now, at the time, the mainstream economic world, they pretty much just ignored it. But the sheer intellectual power of the book was undeniable. As his student Murray Rothbard put it, it was simply one of the finest products of the human mind in our century. So, for the next few decades, the Austrian school was really in the wilderness. The Keynesian way of thinking was dominant, and these ideas were pushed way to the margins. But quietly, in America, the seeds of a comeback were being planted. Even though he didn't have a fancy university post, Mises ran a seminar at NYU, and there he trained a whole new generation of scholars. You had Murray Rothbard, who took Austrian economics and blended it with political philosophy. You had Israel Kirzner, who really zeroed in on the entrepreneur as the engine of the market, and Ludwig Lockmann, who dug deep into how radical uncertainty shapes everything. And then, in 1974, something huge happened. F.A. Hayek won the Nobel Prize in Economics. That was the turning point. It put the school back on the map. That same year, a pivotal academic conference brought a lot of young scholars into the fold, and from there, it just grew. Today, the Austrian school is a thriving global intellectual movement. Which brings us right back to today, and a final thought to leave you with. In our world of big data, AI, and algorithms that predict our every move, what's the value of an economic system that's all about, well, human action? About the creative, purposeful, and, often unpredictable choices that we all make every day? It's a really interesting question, and it's one the legacy of the Austrian school forces us to think about.